And welcome to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case.
I'm Renata Kiss.
And tonight, Democrats revive their failed border bill.
Meanwhile, the U.S. condemns the ICC for targeting Israel.
And California sees the largest baptism event in history.
But before that, we start here. The chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corps announced his resignation after a scathing report. According to a recent probe, the federal agency has been characterized by widespread sexual harassment and discrimination and racism. Here's a snippet of Republican Senator John Kennedy reading the contents of the report to FDIC Chair Martin Gruenberg.
And the FDIC report says that it says that even your senior leaders feel, quote, disrespected, disparaged, and treated unfairly by you. That your long tenure and reputation for losing your temper and bullying people, quote, presents unique challenges, close quote, for you to change the agency.
Gruenberg announced in a statement yesterday that he will step down from his role following that report. Meanwhile, the chairman of the Senate Committee of Banking said in a statement that there must be fundamental changes at the FDIC. He said, quote, those changes begin with new leadership who must fix the agency's toxic culture and put the women and men who work there and their mission first.
Elsewhere, House Republicans are slamming Senate Democrats' plan to bring a failed border deal up for a vote sometime this week. This would be a revival of the bipartisan Senate bill that Republicans rejected earlier this year, saying it would enshrine many of the current problems into federal law. It failed to pass the Senate back in February with a final vote of 49-50 after Speaker Mike Johnson said it would have no chance of passing in the House.
This is dead on arrival. There's no way we could bring this through the House. What it would do is actually further incentivize illegal immigration. It would not resolve any of the problems, not reform in any meaningful way the broken asylum system, the broken parole process, and all the things that have created this catastrophe. And by the way, meanwhile, it further empowers the very cabinet secretary who designed and created this mess.
The bill was originally connected to a foreign aid package, and now Senate Leader Chuck Schumer plans to revive it as a standalone measure sometime this week. House Republicans are once again vowing to block the bill, and it's also unlikely to pass in the Senate, where even some Democrats are expected to oppose it. But it's possible that Schumer's plans are perhaps more political in nature here, perhaps hoping the failed vote will lay at least some of the blame on Republicans for the ongoing border crisis, which, as we know, is shaping up to be a major issue for the presidential election.
And it's election day again as states continue to hold primaries that will shape key contests in November for control of the House. Voters headed to polling stations in Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, and Oregon earlier to settle party squabbles. Notably, Democrat voters will pick their candidate in Oregon, who will attempt to flip a vulnerable Republican seat blue. That spot is currently held by Representative Lori Chavez de Raymer. Elsewhere, sister to progressive lawmaker Pramila Jayapal, Shushila Jayapal, is running against two other Democrats for control of a solid blue Oregon district. Meanwhile, in California, voters are nominating a replacement for ousted House Speaker Kevin McCarthy after his early retirement. Both McCarthy and Trump have endorsed state lawmaker Vince Fong, that is. This is the final day of state primaries for this month, but they'll ramp up again in June.
And both the defense and the prosecution have now rested their case in Trump's hush money trial. According to the Daily Wire, the defense only had two witnesses for the whole trial, one of them a paralegal, and the other a man named Robert Costello. He's a former legal advisor to the prosecution's star witness, namely Trump lawyer Michael Cohen. Trump says he's not guilty of falsifying business records to pay off porn star Stormy Daniels in violation of campaign finance law. And on top of that, he says the whole thing is a form of political persecution. Court is now adjourned until next Tuesday, when closing arguments are expected to take place.
And finally, before our first break here, a new poll shows that never Biden voters outnumber never Trump voters. The Washington Examiner reports that 52% of respondents said they would never vote for President Biden, while only 46% said the same about Trump. This is a complete reversal since the 2020 elections. Since November, a few polls have indicated the switch in voter preference, which means that since Biden took office, more people have favored Trump's previous term. Trump is currently leading by 5 points in a matchup against Biden alone, and he also leads by 3 points when third-party candidates were included in a recent Echelon Insights poll. This comes as both Biden and Trump have agreed to a debate on CNN on June 27th and another on September 10th on ABC. And we'll get into international news when we come back, so stay tuned.
There are moments in life that define us. Choices determine the courses we take. Choices that create life, or those that save a life. And some make life worthwhile. There are decisions to stay or to go, to remain the same or to grow. Sometimes we pray and make peace. Other times we take a stand for what we believe. In celebration, mourning, triumph, and defeat, we are invested in every decision we seek. Despite differences, we have one thing in common, the desire to do all for the glory of God. Keep your wallet aligned with your heart and your investments in harmony with your faith. Timothy Plan, biblically responsible mutual funds, ETFs, and retirement plans. Before investing, carefully consider a fund's investment objective, risks, charges, and expenses contained in the prospectus available at timothyplan.com. Read carefully before investing.
On January 21st, 1824, a baby boy was born in Clarksburg, Virginia. His name was Thomas Jackson, and during the American Civil War, he would become the second most famous general of the Confederate Army after General Robert E. Lee. Most people do not recognize him by his given name, but many do know him by his legendary nickname, Stonewall Jackson. To watch more episodes of A Moment in History, go to FISM.TV.
Tragically, and all too often, a young mother in an unplanned pregnancy is in crisis. You can be there for her by giving a life-changing ultrasound through preborn. Seeing her baby on ultrasound is a game changer, doubling the chances she will choose life from 40% to 80%. For only $28 a month, less than $1 a day, you can show a mom her baby on ultrasound.
And welcome back to FISM News. I'm Renata Kiss. Well, let's get back into our coverage by taking a look at the reactions to the International Criminal Court's announcement yesterday. Here's FISM's Ian Patrick with that story.
Yesterday, the International Criminal Court decided to seek arrest warrants for Hamas officials and Israeli political leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That decision was met with extreme backlash from both Israeli and American voices. Now, just for context, the chief prosecutor of the ICC said that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense chief, quote, bear criminal responsibility for alleged war crimes in Gaza. The chief prosecutor also laid out a list of crimes against Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar, but the likening between Israel and Hamas concerning war crimes has many up in arms, including the Israeli prime minister. Here's what he had to say.
Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. Through this incendiary decision, Mr. Khan takes his place among the great anti-Semites in modern times.
American political figures also had quite a bit to say on the subject. For example, President Biden remarked that there is no equivalence between Hamas and Israel when it comes to the rules of war.
Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. And it's clear Israel wants to do all it can to ensure civilian protection. But let me be clear. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, What's happening is not genocide. We reject that.
The ICC's announcement was also rejected by State Secretary Antony Blinken, according to a press briefing from the State Department yesterday.
As the Secretary said in a statement a short time ago, the United States fundamentally rejects the announcement today from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that he is applying for arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials together with warrants for Hamas terrorists. There should be no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. None.
Another voice came in the form of Robert Greenway, who served on the National Security Council under President Trump. He told Just the News No Noise this week that the United States government should actually seek to impose restrictions on the court because it's gotten too political.
They're very political and selective about the cases they decide to uphold. Give you a couple examples. The genocide in China of the Uyghurs not being investigated or looked at by the ICC, the massacre of civilians by chemical weapons and the creation of a crematoria to get rid of the bodies in Syria, not part of the ICC's spectrum of investigations. So they're incredibly selective about what they choose. It's always political. It's always subversive. The United States and the Congress should be coordinated on their effort to impose restrictions on the ICC. And previously in the Trump administration, we sanctioned its members for its activities, which were subversive and political on the face of it. And I think that activity needs to be resurrected. The court's rogue, it's political, it serves no justifiable purpose. And as long as it's pursuing partisan political objectives, it shouldn't be supported by the United States or the United Nations or the international community.
This may in fact be taken up soon by House Speaker Mike Johnson, who indicated that he is seeking to possibly bring a vote on sanctioning the ICC to the House floor in the near future. Now, it is worth noting that the ICC itself, although it's an influential worldwide political body, cannot enforce these arrest warrants on its own. They rely on members of the court to follow through on such requests. But not every nation recognizes the court's jurisdiction, and that includes both the U.S. and Israel, as well as some other Western states. It does, however, include the, quote, state of Palestine, despite there being no official borders to define the nation. This is Ian Patrick reporting for FISM News.
Thanks as always for that report, Ian. Meanwhile, keeping in news in the Middle East, Iran is now officially confirming the death of President Ebrahim Raisi, which was first reported yesterday. He and several others died in a helicopter crash on Sunday. Now, Iranian state media officially blamed an unspecified technical failure for causing that crash. Meanwhile, back here in the U.S., the White House sparked some criticism for offering condolences to Iran over Raisi's death, a man, by the way, known as the Butcher of Tehran. At the same time, the U.S. also participated in a moment of silence for him at the UN Security Council at the prompting of both Russia and China. The State Department says while Raisi was in fact responsible for many human rights abuses, the U.S. still mourns the loss of life. Take a look.
We have been quite clear that Ebrahim Raisi was a brutal participant in the repression of the Iranian people for nearly 4 decades. He was involved in numerous horrific human rights abuses, including playing a key role in the extrajudicial killing of thousands of political prisoners in 1988. That said, we regret any loss of life. We don't want to see anyone die in a helicopter crash. But that doesn't change the reality of his record, both as a judge and as the president of Iran, the fact that he has blood on his hands.
At the same time, the Islamic State admitted it was behind a brutal attack in Afghanistan last week, which killed 6 people and wounded 7 others. The terrorist organization said ISIS leaders ordered group members to target people from the European Union. The plan was carried out in a major tourist attack. 3 Spanish people were killed, while 4 of the wounded came from Norway, Australia, and Latvia. A U.S. terrorist watchdog group warned last week that terrorist organizations like ISIS and al-Qaeda are growing in Afghanistan and will soon be a threat to U.S. interests. However, the attack defies the Taliban's goal to increase tourism in Afghanistan. A government spokesman says 7 arrests have been made.
And shifting gears a little bit to look at the war in Ukraine, where the U.S. is once again saying it's committed to sending weapons to Ukraine as it now faces a brutal Russian offensive in its northeast. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he restated that commitment yesterday following his meeting with European defense leaders.
We'll continue to push to ensure that Ukraine owns its skies and can defend its citizens and its civilian infrastructure far from the front lines. The United States and our allies and partners worldwide remain laser focused on Ukraine's near-term requirements in Kharkiv and elsewhere. And we'll keep pushing to find swift solutions to Ukraine's most pressing needs.
Now, Austin didn't announce any new aid, but he did reiterate the $400 million package recently announced by President Biden.
And that's why President Biden announced a $400 million security assistance package for Ukraine earlier this month. It will provide critical munitions for NASAMS and Patriot air defense systems, more HIMARS systems and munitions, more anti-armor systems, and other priority requirements.
This comes as Congress approved $61 billion for Ukraine as part of a larger national security package last month.
Meanwhile, Taiwan's new president isn't afraid to criticize China. Former doctor-turned-politician Lai Ching-te started his 4-year term yesterday. Lai was the vice president of former President Tsai Ing-wen, the first female president of Taiwan. Lai is said to be more of a hardliner than his predecessor, and he seems to be proving that point. During his inaugural speech, he called out China's aggressive politics. Take a look.
I also want to call on China to cease their political and military intimidation against Taiwan, share with Taiwan the global responsibility of maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait as well as the greater region, and ensure the world is free from the fear of war. I hope that China will face the reality of the Republic of China's existence, respect the choices of the people of Taiwan.
This comes as China has been ramping up its military presence in the Taiwan Strait after Lai won the election in January. So far, China has refused to accept offers for talks with the island nation. And we have more news coming up next, but first let's go to a moment in history.
Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. In our ongoing journey through history, sometimes, actually quite often, we come across people or things that are heavily disputed, where we don't get a clear answer, but rather we simply try to shine light on the topic. Well, this is one of those times, and in this particular moment in history, we look at a piece of material, a cloth specifically, that has garnered more attention and discussion than perhaps any other. Skeptics call it a fluke, but there are many who believe this very piece of cloth was used to hold the body of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. This, of course, is the legendary Shroud of Turin. Now, more than any other medieval objects that have been alleged to be divine relics, the shroud is, pun intended, shrouded in mystery. It is a 14-foot-long burial cloth with stains on it that appear to match the wounds that Jesus would have suffered on the cross, including where his side was pierced. If it was indeed the actual burial cloth of the Lord Jesus, it was lost to history for nearly 1,000 years after the events of the death and resurrection of Jesus. No one knows exactly when it first appeared in the Middle Ages, but some scholars believe it was a relic of the Byzantine Empire and began to gain notoriety there in the 10th century AD. Now, many historians believe that if this is true, then the shroud made its way to France at the hands of crusaders in the 13th century, most likely during the Fourth Crusade, where the Latin army laid siege on their Byzantine Christian brothers and ransacked Constantinople. The first widely accepted historical appearance of the shroud is in France in the late 1300s. It gained notoriety throughout France as a divine relic, but even in the Middle Ages, many people, including popes, dismissed it as a fake. Now, for the last 600 years, the shroud has undergone incredible scrutiny. It was also almost lost to history multiple times in various fires and wars, but amazingly, only parts of it were damaged. It gets its name from its longtime home of Turin in present-day Italy, where it has remained under safekeeping in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist since the 1570s. Many scientists and forensic experts are skeptical that this was indeed Jesus' burial cloth, but many have also not been able to explain away the placement of the markings and the possibility of an ancient origin. Its date of creation is highly debated, with some believing it to be from the 13th century, but others believing it to be much older. Well, the shroud is and will probably be a mystery for the future, but what is not a mystery is the man who is forever linked to this historical artifact. The truth is, we don't know if Jesus laid to rest in this burial cloth, but we do know this: he did not stay dead. And that is reason enough to celebrate, even as we remain baffled by the mystery of the Shroud of Turin. Thanks so much for joining me once again for A Moment in History. Throughout the month of May, FISM is partnering with Preborn to fund the light by providing 100 ultrasound machines to pro-life centers around the country. Now, how can you contribute? Well, for as little as $28, you can provide an ultrasound scan to an abortion-minded woman in crisis. And when that woman hears the heartbeat of her baby, she will choose life, get this, 90% of the time. It's remarkable. And guess what? With the help of a donor match, for every 200 scans donated, that's for a net value of $5,600, Preborn Ministries will be gifted an ultrasound machine to place at a clinic in need. Each machine has the potential to impact hundreds of thousands of mothers' choices. Preborn also offers additional support to mothers in need and presents the gospel to every mother who comes into their clinics, knowing that salvation is the greatest gift that can be given to a mother and her child. So go to preborn.com/FISM to give. That's preborn.com/FISM. What can you tell our listeners about the benefits of being a partner?
It's blessed me with an opportunity to help further the kingdom in a small way, which matters a lot because God takes small things and makes them big. The blessing really has been to be able to take care of my family, but also take care of the kingdom. Going to bed knowing that not only are you correctly managing your investments, but you're doing it in a God-honoring way.
Welcome back to FISM News once again. While we return with some national coverage, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a critical warning yesterday about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in our nation's water infrastructure. The EPA discovered that more than 70% of water systems violate standards meant to protect them from malicious tampering. It is now urging immediate actions to protect the clean water supply in the U.S. Officials warn that some water suppliers are making big mistakes. For example, using default passwords to access systems or using a single login for all employees. Agency administrators recently advised all state governors of the urgent threat to clean drinking water in the U.S.
And this is actually a really big deal because the FBI has been actively warning Congress that, hey, China is looking to target our infrastructure and, probably perhaps the most critical infrastructure of all besides maybe electricity is water. Those go hand in hand as the most important. So this really is something that they're going to have to beef up their security on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is always how China works. They always want to disrupt internal systems in the U.S. because they know that when chaos erupts, they can, do whatever they want, essentially.
Yeah.
So,
and they know we've also become fairly weakened as a population, become so reliant on these things. We're not going to know what to do if there's ever a disruption with our water or power or whatever. It's very scary.
Scary stuff, yeah.
Meanwhile, speaking of infrastructure here, the cargo ship that destroyed Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge is now back on the surface today. As yesterday morning, crews successfully brought the ship, called the Dolly, finally up from the water. It's been 2 months now since that accident, and during that time, there have been 150 underwater missions trying to cut through the wreckage in order to free the ship. The Dolly has now been moved to the port of Baltimore. Meanwhile, officials say they will now try to work on opening a wider and deeper channel for commercial shipping vessels to pass through.
We understand that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
We're going to continue to expand that channel and get rid of all the wreckage, even the wreckage that's below the mudline that has been pushed and forced deep under the riverbed.
Meanwhile, in Texas, a federal judge temporarily blocked the Biden administration's sweeping gun control law in the state. U.S. District Judge Matthew Kaczmarek put a temporary hold on Biden's background check law that was meant to close the gun show loophole. That is, where any firearm seller must be registered under government regulations and require background checks for buyers. Gun Owners of America, a pro-Second Amendment group, applauded the judge's ruling. Prosecutors in the case argued that the Biden administration's law violated the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022 and a Second Amendment. Kaczmarek didn't agree with the constitutional violation, but he did rule that the law went against a bipartisan act. It's worth noting, however, that the temporary block only refers to Texas and not the other states that have joined the lawsuit as well.
And still in politics here, Democrats are keeping the topic of abortion in the headlines ahead of the upcoming election, and Senate Democrats in particular are now renewing their efforts to codify Roe v. Wade into federal law. One of those Democrats is Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, who, by the way, faces a rather tough re-election this year. As a result, she's now campaigning on a promise to end the Senate's 60-vote filibuster in order to make it happen. Threats to, quote-unquote, nuke the filibuster over abortion, they aren't exactly new, but the plan has seen some gaining traction. For example, Arizona's Mark Kelly, Pennsylvania's Bob Casey, and Minnesota's Amy Klobuchar are now all in support of that move, and it's also supported by former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as well.
If President Biden gets reelected and there's a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, what can President Biden and the Democrats do to protect abortion nationwide?
Very clearly, we can enshrine into the law Roe v. Wade, and that makes a big difference.
That would take 2/3 in the Senate. You think the Democrats can get 2/3 in the Senate?
No, it doesn't get 2/3. No, it doesn't. I mean, 60 votes is the Senate now, but if we win 50 plus 1 in the Senate, 50 plus the vice president, we can overturn the 60-vote rule.
The filibuster.
The filibuster, and pass it with a 51-vote margin.
Meanwhile, GOP Senators Ted Cruz and Katie Britt are moving to protect IVF procedures at the federal level. According to the Daily Wire, the two authored the IVF Protection Act to discourage states from outlawing IVF services. If the law passes through both chambers, it would also allow Medicaid members to receive the treatment instead of being blocked from federal aid. Senator Cruz said in a statement, quote, "IVF has given miraculous hope to millions of Americans, and it has given families across the country the gift of children." This comes as other GOP senators had blocked a previous IVF bill introduced by Democrats. Conservative senators have argued that they don't want the federal government to meddle in state affairs since the overturn of Roe v. Wade.
And we end today's show with some truly incredible news coming out of California, where on Sunday, more than 12,000 people were baptized across the entire state in what the ministry called Baptized California is calling the largest synchronized baptism in history. Here's just a small bit of what that looked like.
Today, I'm not talking about a way, I'm talking about the way. I'm not talking about a life, I'm talking about the life. And right now, with hands held high, we're inviting the God of the universe into your heart.
Now, the event took place on Pentecost Sunday. That's when Christians around the world commemorate the first outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Singer Sean Foyt held a 2-day worship event at Huntington Beach, California, as part of that weekend of baptisms. He said this, quote, "God is moving in California, a state that people often think is too far gone, but yet God always has a response, and his response is revival."
And I'm personally encouraged by this story because I'm from California, so I know that living there, it can be difficult and it can be dark. So I think that's just a great testimony to the Lord's faithfulness.
It made me think. We often talk about the rough political situation in California, to say the least, and we can get depressed about that. But really, that's minimizing God's power. And Sean Foyt's right about that. He really can move even a state like that.
Amen. All right, well, that's our program for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and please visit FISMnews.tv for more content.
And be sure to check us out on social media as well. Until our next show, you can find us at FISM News or by downloading the FISM app. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.